Welcome to The Debate. Today we are turning our analytical focus toward a massive structural paradigm shift proposed for the very foundation of human civilization. We're looking at Zachary David Enfield's collected essays, which argue that we have basically reached the absolute physical limit of our current infrastructure. Enfield proposes a complete transition away from our linear, extractive industrial economy and replacing it with a circular, biological infrastructure. We are talking about engineered ecosystems. So, programmable microalgae, duckweed nutrient loops, biosphere greenhouses, becoming the new steel and concrete of our world. I look at this material and I see a proven, economically superior, and absolutely necessary evolution. The math on our current trajectory simply doesn't work anymore, and biology offers the only viable way forward.
And I come at it from a completely different angle. I certainly respect the ambition of Enfield's framework. It is conceptually brilliant, I'll give it that. But the central question we really have to evaluate is whether these living systems can realistically and safely serve as the primary foundational infrastructure of modern civilization. From my reading of the material, scaling these biological systems introduces severe ecological risks. It relies entirely on unpredictable seasonal biology, and it faces rigid institutional frictions that make this framework an impractical and potentially dangerous overreach.
To really understand why this shift is even being proposed, we need to start with what Enfield diagnoses as the linear fallacy. This is the fatal flaw at the heart of how we currently run the world. Right now, industrial civilization operates on a one-way street. We extract finite resources, we burn them or use them for a fraction of a second in the grand scheme of things, and then we just discard the waste into the atmosphere and our waterways. The consequences of this linear transaction are not abstract models, they are catastrophic, mathematically measurable realities happening right now.
The depletion data in the text is definitely sobering. There is no denying the raw numbers there.
Exactly. Look at the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a massive geological water reservoir under the Great Plains that took somewhere between 6 to 12 million years to form. Yet the current data projects that the Texas Panhandle portion of that aquifer is facing a 70% depletion within just 20 years. We are draining millions of years of geological savings in a single human lifetime.
And on the flip side of that extraction is the pollution. We apply roughly 12 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer annually in the United States alone. A massive fraction of that is never absorbed by the crops. It simply washes off the fields, flows down the Mississippi River, and continuously expands this huge hypoxic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Precisely. So the structural correction Enfield proposes is biological carbon capture and storage, or bio-CCS, heavily combined with circular nutrient loops. Instead of building massive, expensive mechanical filtration plants, we use photosynthetic organisms. Microalgae, for instance, is a powerhouse. The text points out that microalgae can produce 10,000 gallons of oil per acre annually, all while fixing 12 tons of carbon dioxide per acre. When you compare that to our traditional agricultural crops, like soybeans, which produce a mere 48 gallons of oil per acre, the efficiency delta is staggering. And the key here is programmable biology. By using modern tools, we can intercept industrial waste and continuously convert it into drop-in aviation fuel, fertilizer, and livestock feed. It changes waste from a liability into a highly valuable feedstock.
I will freely acknowledge the conceptual elegance of a circular biological economy. When you read the material, it is beautiful on paper, but there is a very good reason why civil engineers and regulators rightly favor mechanical certainty over biological variability. When we are talking about the infrastructure that keeps the lights on and water clean for billions of people, we need absolute predictability. The material explicitly details some severe ecological risks when you try to scale these biological interventions into the open environment.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. The risks exist, of course, but the text outlines exactly how they are managed through modern engineering.
I'm not entirely sure they can be managed as neatly as Enfield suggests. Take constructed wetlands, for example. If they are not perfectly maintained and the water stops flowing correctly, they go anaerobic. When that happens, they stop cleaning water and start producing methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas that is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. You could accidentally build a massive climate warming engine while trying to treat wastewater. Furthermore, scaling up open algae systems carries the inherent risk of triggering toxic cyanobacterial blooms. These aren't just an aesthetic problem. These blooms produce microcystins, toxins that actively kill livestock, poison wildlife, and can completely decimate downstream ecosystems.
Those historical examples of blooms and methane production usually stem from passive, unmanaged biological dumping, not the precise infrastructure Enfield is advocating for.
But biological systems are exquisitely sensitive to chemical disruptions in a way that steel, concrete, and mechanical filtration simply are not. Think about a municipal or industrial wastewater stream. A single slug of an industrial solvent inadvertently entering the intake pipe can crash an entire duckweed pond in a matter of hours. The microorganisms just die. Expecting living, breathing, vulnerable ecosystems to replace stable mechanical infrastructure fundamentally ignores the unpredictability of biology. The elegance of the theory just does not survive the chaos of the open environment.
Let's unpack that concept of open environmental chaos, because I believe your concern, while incredibly valid for 20th century environmentalism, rests on an outdated understanding of how we can now govern these systems. The interventions we are discussing are no longer blunt instruments. They operate on what the material calls the programmable biology stack. We are not just pouring a bucket of algae into a retention pond, crossing our fingers, and hoping for the best.
But you are still operating in open water. A cyanobacteria bloom or a hypoxic dead zone caused by a massive die-off of decaying algae, these are historically documented realities of scaled biological infrastructure. And Enfield proposes adding engineered bacteriophages or CRISPR-edited organisms into these open systems. That introduces countless new genetic variables that we simply cannot fully model. Ecology is infinitely complex. You cannot have total predictive control over a living system once it interacts with wild weather, native species, and shifting temperatures.
That's a fair hesitation, but let's look at the actual mechanics of the programmable biology stack, because the level of control is unprecedented. Take bacteriophages, for example. Unlike traditional chemical treatments that just wipe out everything in the water, phages provide an absolute lock-and-key targeting mechanism. They are viruses that can be programmed to identify and eliminate specific, problematic bacterial strains without harming the broader, necessary microbiome of the pond. Then you layer in CRISPR, which provides exact genetic logic. You can literally edit the organisms to disable specific traits, like the very toxin production in cyanobacteria you were just warning about.
Genetic editing is precise in the lab, yes. But mutation is a feature of biology, not a bug.
Which is exactly why the stack includes optogenetics. For those not reading molecular biology journals every day, optogenetics essentially allows us to use literal wavelengths of light as a true on-off switch for cellular functions. The ultimate proof of this precise control is demonstrated in the materials analysis of prion-like protein aggregates. The text details how researchers are using specific wavelengths of near-infrared and UVB light to literally construct and disassemble these highly resilient protein structures on command. Let that sink in. We can exert electromagnetic control over the folding states of recalcitrant proteins. If we have that level of molecular mastery, we can absolutely manage the metabolic pathways of a duckweed pond. And to your earlier point about constructed wetlands generating methane, the infrastructure relies on floating treatment wetlands. These are engineered to passively maintain aerobic root zones, which fundamentally prevents the anaerobic conditions that produce methane and toxic blooms in the first place.
That is a compelling argument regarding the genetic and molecular precision. But I think we need to step out of the petri dish and look at the physical and thermal limitations of biology. Let's pivot to the realities of geography, specifically continental climates. Enfield talks a lot about agricultural applications in places like Nebraska. You can engineer the genetics perfectly. You can hit the duckweed with all the near-infrared light you want. But the fundamental laws of biology dictate that duckweed growth drops substantially when the water temperature falls below 15 degrees Celsius, and it stops entirely below 10 degrees. You simply cannot photosynthesize your way out of a blizzard.
You're right, temperature is the ultimate biological governor. But the infrastructure model isn't ignoring winter.
It's worse than ignoring it. The spatial constraints compound the seasonal failure. Let's look at the numbers for integrating this with our energy grid. A single 500-megawatt coal plant produces an astronomical amount of carbon dioxide. To remediate that output entirely using biological carbon capture, you would require an open algae pond roughly the size of a small city. So you are asking society to accept a massive spatial footprint for a biological infrastructure that fundamentally fails during the winter months. And when do the electrical and heating demands of industrial civilization reach their absolute peak? In the dead of winter. The system breaks down exactly when we need it the most.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes a false premise that we must leave the biology exposed to the open elements. The solution to the seasonality and spatial constraint is the biosphere greenhouse architecture, and the material gives a spectacular proof of concept for this right in the middle of that freezing continental climate. The text highlights the Henry Dorley Zoo's Lee Jungle in Omaha, Nebraska. For over 30 years, they have maintained a 1.5-acre tropical rainforest that thrives, deeply green and incredibly biodiverse, in the absolute dead of a Nebraska winter.
Yes, I'm familiar with the light jungle. It is a marvel, but it is heated by purchasing massive amounts of grid energy. That is an enormous operating expense. You can't scale that to a civilizational level without bankrupting the system. It's an energy sink, not an infrastructure solution.
That is exactly where the industrial symbiosis occurs. You mentioned the 500-megawatt coal plant and its massive emissions. We have to look at the thermodynamics of that plant. It generates 500 megawatts of electricity, yes, but in doing so, it also discards between 400 and 600 megawatts of pure waste heat into the environment. It literally has to build massive cooling towers just to throw that thermal energy away. Enfield's model changes the equation. If we pipe that free, continuous waste heat, along with the plant's highly concentrated, pure CO2 exhaust, directly into co-located sealed greenhouse structures, we entirely bypass the seasonality constraint.
So you're marrying the power plant directly to the greenhouse.
Exactly. You eliminate the expensive cooling cost for the power plant, you completely eliminate the heating cost for the greenhouse, and you provide the exact thermal and chemical environment the microalgae and duckweed need to operate at absolute peak efficiency 12 months a year regardless of the blizzard outside. We are taking two massive industrial cost centers, waste heat and carbon emissions, and combining them into a year-round revenue generator that produces fuel and feed.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the execution will be that seamless. Let me tell you why. Let us assume, for the sake of the argument, that the biology works perfectly without mutating. Let us assume the thermal engineering and the biosphere greenhouses function exactly as you describe, and the thermal dynamics balance out. You still hit a brick wall, and that wall is human behavior and institutional silos. The level of integration you are talking about is virtually impossible in our current economic and regulatory framework.
How so? If the math works, the market usually adapts.
Because the silos are deep and rigid. You are talking about piping industrial waste heat from a privately owned utility to an agricultural greenhouse, which is treating municipal wastewater, managed by a city government, to create jet fuel regulated by the FAA. The Municipal Sanitation Authority does not talk to the state agricultural extension services. The heavily regulated power utility does not have a commercial relationship with the neighboring commercial feedlot. You are asking incredibly risk-averse, highly regulated bureaucracies to suddenly merge their operations into a single, seamless biological machine?
Institutional inertia is absolutely a hurdle, I won't deny that. But economic gravity is always stronger than bureaucratic friction.
But the economics often drive the exact opposite behaviors we need for conservation. Consider the efficiency paradox detailed in the material, specifically regarding the Ogallala aquifer we discussed earlier. When Frank Zybach invented the center pivot irrigation system, it was hailed as a miracle. It radically improved water application efficiency over the old gravity ditches. Did the profit-driven farmers conserve that saved water? Absolutely not. The economics dictated that because irrigation was now cheaper and more efficient, they simply expanded their irrigated acreage. That expansion actually accelerated the depletion of the aquifer. Worse,
It eliminated the inadvertent wetland recharge zones that the old, inefficient, leaky gravity ditches used to create.
Expecting profit-driven agricultural and energy corporations to suddenly voluntarily adopt an ethic of planetary citizenship, where they eagerly spend capital to build Earth-share zones to treat their runoff out of a sense of global duty.
Right. It is hopelessly utopian.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame the motivation quite differently. You're right about the Jevons paradox. Efficiency usually leads to more consumption, but they are not going to adopt this biological infrastructure out of some newfound altruism or global duty. They will do it because the economics of resource scarcity will absolutely force the transition. We are already seeing the proof of this institutional integration happening at scale. Look at the Netherlands. The material cites the OCAP project. They successfully repurpose an old, abandoned crude oil pipeline to deliver industrial carbon dioxide from a Shell refinery directly to over 600 commercial greenhouses.
And that is a fascinating repurposing of stranded mechanical assets. It is, and by doing so, they displaced 330 million cubic meters of natural gas combustion annually. The greenhouse operators got the CO2 they needed to boost crop yields, and the refinery offloaded its waste. It wasn't done for environmental charity. It was done because it is wildly profitable for everyone involved. The silos broke down because there was money to be made. Furthermore, let's look at the duckweed loop we are discussing for agriculture. The text shows it can achieve a 99.1% nitrogen removal rate from agricultural runoff. That allows a farmer to harvest that fast-growing duckweed biomass and use it to reduce the reliance on expensive, imported synthetic fertilizers by up to 50%. In a margin-thin industry like farming, a 50% reduction in your biggest input cost isn't an environmental sacrifice, it is an aggressive business upgrade.
A 50% reduction in synthetic fertilizer is a powerful incentive, I grant you, but it still requires a massive upfront capital expenditure. You have to physically build these biosphere complexes, the heat exchange piping, and the duckweed channels. In a margin-thin agricultural economy, convincing stakeholders to take on that kind of debt to rethink a century of civil engineering is a monumental task. Capital markets prefer the predictable returns of the linear model, even if that model is ultimately doomed over the next 50 years.
Which brings me to the ultimate catalyst that Enfield outlines: strategic urgency. The material contextualizes this entire infrastructure transition against the looming geopolitical realities of 2026, specifically the scenario modeling the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the geopolitical shock doctrine.
Exactly. When 20% of the world's traded oil is suddenly disrupted, the conversation changes overnight. In that scenario, algae-derived, drop-in jet fuel is no longer an environmental luxury. It is no longer a niche bioproject for a university lab. It becomes an immediate, critical national security mandate. That level of strategic pressure overcomes institutional inertia and capital market hesitations instantly. The military and commercial aviation sectors simply cannot afford to wait for state agricultural extension offices to update their pamphlets. They need liquid fuels that do not rely on highly vulnerable maritime choke points. That demand will force the massive capital investment into these biological systems, scaling them up at wartime speed.
I will concede that a severe national security crisis, like the closure of Hormuz, creates rapid, forced institutional alignment. History proves that. However, looking at the entire scope of what we've discussed today, we must summarize where this really leaves us. While I acknowledge the profound brilliance of circular biology, and I certainly see its incredible utility as a supplementary tool for things like localized fertilizer reduction, I maintain my core hesitation. Relying on complex, vulnerable living ecosystems for our primary energy, waste management, and agricultural infrastructure drastically underestimates both the physical limits of biology and the rigid historical realities of human institutions. We are essentially placing the immense weight of modern civilization on the microscopic shoulders of duckweed and microalgae, hoping that our newfound technological mastery of CRISPR and optogenetics will somehow prevent an ecological collapse. It is a breathtaking risk to take with the systems that keep humanity alive.
And I will summarize my position by pointing straight back to the mathematics of our current reality. Integrating light-governed,
programmable biology with our massive industrial waste streams, specifically heat and CO2, is the only mathematically viable way to maintain human civilization without entirely liquidating our ecological capital. We can debate the risks of cyanobacteria or institutional friction, but the risk of the biological transition is ultimately eclipsed by the absolute certainty of our current trajectory. If we stay on the linear path, the math dictates that the system fails.
On that specific point, we share a firm convergence based on the text. The current linear model of industrial extraction and waste is, without question, mathematically doomed. The rapid depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer and the relentless expansion of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone are not abstract predictive models that we can debate. They are measurable, compounding realities happening as we speak. They demand an immediate structural shift in how we metabolize resources on this planet. The mechanical era of extract and discard is reaching its physical endpoint.
It truly is. At the end of the day, we're looking at a massive civilizational trade-off. Do we stick with the mechanical infrastructure we know, even though the raw math proves it's actively depleting our planet? Or do we take a massive, ambitious leap into living biological infrastructure, accepting all the chaotic risks and complexities that come with relying on living systems? Examining our infrastructure through these multiple lenses, weighing the illusion of mechanical safety against the necessary elegance of biology, is a profound exercise. The material we've explored today offers vast remaining depths regarding how we might design our future, and there is certainly much more nuance to explore in Enfield's work.
The tension between what we have the arrogance to engineer and what nature will actually tolerate remains the defining question of our time.
Thank you for joining us on the debate. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence from today's discussion and determine for yourself whether the massive, complex solution to our civilizational crisis has indeed been floating on the surface of the water this whole time.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us, it's probably because you've looked around at the infrastructure powering your life.
Yeah.
The water from your tap, the food on your table, the fuel in your car. And you've probably thought, how much longer can this possibly run?
Right. How much runway do we actually have left?
Exactly. Today, we are answering that question by looking at a blueprint for basically fundamentally redesigning human civilization's relationship with nature. We're talking about shifting away from a model of mechanical extraction.
Where we just take a resource, burn it, and toss the waste.
Right. Shifting from that to a model of programmable circular biology.
It is a profound shift in thinking. And to really unpack it, we're diving into a fascinating stack of essays written in 2026 by Zachary David Enfield.
Yeah, the primary texts we are looking at are called From the Ground Up and Life, Light, Code, and Infrastructure.
Plus 2 of his really detailed addendums, The Biosphere Imperative and Descent. What Enfield lays out here is just a radical yet incredibly scientifically grounded architecture. I mean, he's proposing that we can solve our most urgent resource crises, not with, more cold, heavy machinery, but by utilizing things as simple as algae, duckweed.
Light programmable proteins.
Yes, and industrial waste heat.
So our mission for this deep dive is to completely unpack that architecture for you.
Right.
We want to explore how those really simple biological tools can be combined to fuel our jets, feed our agriculture, and even help us live off-world one day.
Which sounds like sci-fi, but it's really not.
Not at all. But to truly understand why this is necessary, the sources hit us with a gripping reality check right out of the gate.
Yeah, they set the scene on February 28, 2026.
The closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. Suddenly, basically overnight, 20% of the world's traded oil is physically blocked.
Blocked from moving entirely. And gas prices spiked 17% almost instantly.
And while the whole world is panicking over that energy supply chain, the American Midwest is quietly staring down what they call day zero for its agricultural water supply.
So you've got this dual crisis, and that is exactly where Enfield begins his argument.
He introduces this concept he calls the linear fallacy.
The linear fallacy.
Yeah. The basic idea here is that industrial civilization treats biological and geological cycles as, one-way transactions.
We just operate under the assumption that we can perpetually extract, burn, and discard.
Exactly. Think about it. We mine phosphate rock out of the earth. We manufacture it into synthetic fertilizer. We apply it to a cornfield, harvest the crop, and then,
We just let the excess nutrients wash away.
right, we flush it down the river. At every single stage of that process, a piece of a natural closed cycle is severed. It's sent on a one-way journey toward entropy.
I think we really need to dwell on that because treating the Earth like a one-way trash chute is what brought us to the three interconnected crises the sources highlight.
The first one being the depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer.
Right. If you live anywhere near the Great Plains, you know this is the massive underground reservoir that essentially makes American agriculture possible.
It supplies about 30% of all U.S. irrigation groundwater.
30%. Now, the geological timeline here is what makes this a linear failure, right?
Yeah, it took somewhere between 6 and 12 million years for that aquifer to fill up with glacial melt and ancient rain.
Millions of years.
And today, the sources point to data showing an average drop of 28.2 feet in Kansas.
Wow.
And in some parts of Texas, the water levels have plunged over 150 feet.
150 feet. That's just...
When you're dealing with a resource that takes millions of years to replenish, a 150-foot drop in a few decades is the very definition of unsustainable.
The math just doesn't work.
No. The projections in the text show that 70% of the Texas Panhandle portion of this aquifer will be functionally unusable in just 20 years.
20 years. So for you listening, that isn't some distant theoretical problem for future generations. That is a hard physical limit approaching right now. The well simply runs dry.
Which brings us directly to the second crisis Enfield outlines. And this one is happening downstream of those dying aquifers.
The Gulf of Mexico dead zone.
Exactly. Because we treat agriculture as a linear transaction, we are essentially taking all those synthetic fertilizers and just flushing them away.
The text notes that roughly 12 million tons of nitrogen and 4 million tons of phosphorus fertilizer are washed down the Mississippi River every single year.
Every year. And when that massive concentrated nutrient load heats the Gulf of Mexico, it triggers this massive explosion of algae.
But then the algae dies.
Right. And when it decomposes, that process consumes all the oxygen in the water.
It creates a hypoxic region, a dead zone where oxygen levels are so low that marine life simply suffocates.
And currently, that dead zone spans over 6,000 square miles.
6,000 square miles of dead ocean. And then, of course, we have the third crisis.
Atmospheric carbon.
Right. By burning fossil fuels, we're taking carbon that was safely sequestered deep underground.
Over hundreds of millions of years.
Right. Geological time.
Yeah.
And we're releasing it into the atmosphere all at once.
We are doing this at a rate that the biological carbon cycle, the trees, the oceans, the soil, they just cannot possibly absorb it.
It's basically like running a household by permanently tearing down the load-bearing walls just to keep your fireplace burning.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, sure, you might stay comfortably warm for a night or two, but eventually the roof is going to come crashing down on your head. You're consuming the structural integrity of your environment for a short-term burst of energy.
That analogy gets to the absolute core of Enfield's synthesis here, because he argues forcefully that we cannot view the draining of the aquifer, the dead zone in the Gulf, and atmospheric carbon as three separate environmental problems.
They are isolated.
No. They don't require three separate technological solutions. They are all manifestations of a single structural error.
A mechanical failure of our economic system.
Yes. We are treating vital ecosystem services, the water in the aquifer, the ecological balance of the river, the carbon capacity of the atmosphere, we treat them as externalities.
Meaning they just don't show up on a corporate balance sheet.
Precisely. The power company, burning coal, gets to record the revenue from the electricity sold. Meanwhile, the atmosphere absorbs the debt of the carbon.
Right. The synthetic fertilizer manufacturer books the profit, while the coastal fishing communities down in Louisiana inherit the dead zone.
The system privatizes the gains and socializes the ecological losses.
But Enfield doesn't just point out the impending doom here. And honestly, that's what makes these essays so compelling for this deep dive.
He offers a way out.
He proposes that the severity of these linear problems can actually be reversed by closing the loops. And his solution relies on something completely unexpected.
Tiny aquatic plants.
Tiny plants. This is what he calls the photosynthetic imperative.
Instead of trying to invent massive, energy-hungry, mechanical carbon capture machines, he says we need to look at microalgae and duckweed.
And the shift from mechanical to biological thinking here is crucial.
It really is. When we think about producing biofuels or capturing carbon today, We usually think about terrestrial crops
Planting miles and miles of corn for ethanol.
or soybeans for biodiesel. But Enfield points out a massive thermodynamic inefficiency in that approach.
Terrestrial crops have to fight gravity.
Right, they fight gravity, they fight the weather, they waste an enormous amount of their captured solar energy just building structural tissue.
I to build deep root systems, thick stalks, sturdy leaves.
Exactly. They build all that out of complex polymers like lignin and cellulose just to stand upright in the wind.
But algae floats.
It floats. Because it is suspended in water, it doesn't need a skeleton.
It doesn't need roots.
No. And that means it can focus almost all of its photosynthetic energy on creating lipids.
Which are oils.
Right. And the math Enfield presents on this is just staggering.
Yeah, the sources note that soybeans, which are currently one of our primary domestic feedstocks for biodiesel, they yield about 48 gallons of oil per acre per year.
48 gallons.
But microalgae, grown under optimal conditions, it can theoretically produce 10,000 gallons of oil per acre per year.
10,000 gallons compared to 48. It is a profound leap in efficiency.
You are looking at a yield that is somewhere between 100 and 200 times greater per unit of land area.
To put that in perspective for you, Enfield calculates that dedicating roughly 3% of U.S. cropland to high-yield algae cultivation could theoretically meet the total national demand for transportation fuel.
Just 3%.
3%. That completely changes the debate around food versus fuel that has plagued the ethanol industry for decades.
And then the text introduces duckweed, which might actually be the unsung hero of this entire architecture.
I think so. Duckweed, specifically Lemna minor, is a floating aquatic plant about the size of a lentil.
It doesn't look like much.
It really doesn't. But its growth rate is explosive. It doubles its entire biomass in as little as 16 to 48 hours.
That's incredibly fast. And here is the critical part for solving that linear fallacy we talked about earlier. When you introduce duckweed to wastewater or agricultural runoff, it acts like a biological sponge.
The text states it can remove up to 96% of total phosphorus and 99.1% of nitrogen from the water.
99.1%. It effectively inhales the pollution that causes those dead zones in the Gulf.
Which naturally leads to a very common apprehension. I mean, if you are growing a hyperabsorbent plant in raw sewage or chemical runoff, isn't the resulting plant mass highly contaminated?
Right. That was my immediate thought when reading through the proposal. If it's cleaning up toxins, doesn't it become toxic itself? You can't just take a plant that just absorbed municipal waste and feed it to cattle.
Or put it on a food crop.
Exactly. But Enfield anticipates this exact concern. He addresses it with what he calls the two-stream solution.
You strictly separate the end use based on the water source.
The duckweed that is grown in municipal sewage or heavy industrial wastewater becomes treatment biomass.
You harvest it, you put it into an anaerobic digester to create biogas for electricity.
And the remaining material is safely processed into biofertilizer for non-food applications.
Perfect. And the second stream is feed biomass.
Feed biomass.
This is duckweed grown in clean, controlled water environments, strictly for agricultural use.
Because duckweed is so efficient at converting nutrients into biomass, this clean stream produces livestock feed that packs an incredible 33 to 44% crude protein.
So you have the exact same biological tool separated into two distinct infrastructural streams,
Completely eliminating the contamination risk.
while solving two massive economic needs: waste treatment and high-protein animal feed.
I just love how this reframes the whole concept of waste. Enfield brings up this idea of misplaced fertility.
Misplaced fertility, yes.
It makes you realize that sewage and agricultural runoff aren't inherently poisonous substances.
No, they're just biological raw materials that we've stupidly dumped into the wrong environment. I think misplaced fertility is perhaps the most important conceptual pivot in the entire text. We look at a feedlot lagoon or a municipal sewer pipe and we see a toxic liability.
Something we have to spend millions of dollars to sanitize and hide.
Exactly. But the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the carbon in that water, those are the exact same fundamental building blocks that farmers pay a fortune to spray onto their fields.
We have just disconnected them from their biological cycles.
When we introduce duckweed into the wastewater equation, we aren't just cleaning the water, we are relinking that cycle.
The water becomes cleaner, not because the nutrients magically disappear into the ether, but because they are physically embodied in a harvestable, valuable plant.
A plant that can be returned to the soil or fed to animals.
This connects directly to a fascinating historical critique in the sources regarding what Enfield calls the efficiency paradox.
Ah, yes. Looking specifically at how we irrigate the American Midwest.
If you drive through states like Nebraska or Kansas, you see those massive center pivot irrigators.
The huge metal arms on wheels that spray water in perfect circles.
Right. They're engineering marvels. And they are 95 to 98% efficient at getting water directly to the crop roots without wasting a drop.
Which sounds like an absolute triumph of agricultural engineering.
Exactly. It sounds perfect. But the paradox Ed Enfield points out is that the older, highly inefficient gravity ditch irrigation systems,
The ones where farmers just flooded unlined trenches.
right, those used to leak terribly. But that leaked water wasn't actually lost.
It wasn't. That seepage slowly filtered down through the soil and actually recharged the Ogala aquifer.
And the surface water in those open ditches evaporated into the air, creating enough local humidity to trigger regular summer thunderstorms.
So by optimizing our irrigation to be perfectly efficient at the micro level,
We sealed off the surface.
we stopped the aquifer recharge, and we dried out the local atmosphere at the macro level.
We solved a local engineering problem, but broke the regional hydrological cycle.
And Enfield's proposed solution to this is what he calls Ditch 2.0.
Ditch 2.0.
He argues that we need to actively engineer shallow, slow-moving channels alongside our agricultural fields and fill them with duckweed.
So these aren't just drainage ditches, they are active biological processing facilities.
Exactly. As the fertilizer-heavy runoff from the fields enters the ditch, the duckweed filters out the excess nitrogen and phosphorus.
The bottom of the dish is designed with permeable liners to purposefully allow clean, filtered water to seep back down and recharge the aquifer.
And the massive surface area of the duckweed transpires moisture back into the air.
To help bring the local rain back.
Think about what happens when you scale that up. Imagine transforming the entire American Midwest with this Ditch 2.0 model.
You are completely upending the synthetic fertilizer industry,
Right now, that industry relies on the Haber-Bosch process.
which literally pulls nitrogen out of the air using extreme heat and pressure. It consumes massive amounts of natural gas in the process.
It is incredibly energy intensive.
But in Enfield's model, instead of farmers buying expensive synthetic nitrogen, applying it to their fields, and flushing the excess away into the Gulf of Mexico,
They grow duckweed in their own drainage ditches.
the economic implications for the farmer are profound here.
They harvest that duckweed from their own ditches, run it through a basic on-farm digester or composting process, and turn it back into biofertilizer.
Suddenly, the farmer isn't just a consumer of fertilizer, they are a producer of fertilizer.
The nutrient pollution flowing down the Mississippi stops, the aquifer begins to slowly recharge, and the farm's operating costs drop dramatically.
It is a perfect example of how circular biology outperforms linear mechanics.
But Enfield doesn't stop at the macro level of ditches and fields.
No, this is where the essays take a really fascinating turn into the microscopic world.
He transitions from macroecology to molecular architecture.
He outlines what he calls a programmable biology stack.
He compares it to how we build software with different layers of code. But instead of writing code for silicon chips, we are merging information technology with living cellular systems.
It is a vital transition in the text. To truly master circular biology, we need tools that are far more precise than just planting seeds and hoping for the best.
We need the ability to direct biological outcomes with surgical precision.
And Enfield breaks this programmable stack down into 3 distinct layers.
Layer 1 is targeting, and this is achieved using bacteriophages.
Phages. For those who might not be familiar with the mechanics of phages, they are incredibly specific viruses that only infect bacteria.
Think of how we currently treat a bacterial problem, say a human infection or an agricultural blight. We use broad-spectrum antibiotics.
And the problem with antibiotics is that they're like a sledgehammer.
They kill the bad bacteria, but they also wipe out the entire beneficial microbiome in the process.
Right. Phages, on the other hand, are a lock-and-key delivery system.
A specific phage is evolved to attach to and penetrate only one highly specific strain of bacteria, leaving every other organism around it completely untouched.
They are the ultimate targeted delivery vehicle.
Precisely. And once that phage has locked on to its specific target, we reach layer 2 of the stack, intervention.
Intervention. This is where the text brings in CRISPR-Cas systems.
CRISPR originally evolved in nature as a bacterial immune system, a way for bacteria to remember and slice up the DNA of invading viruses.
But scientists have successfully repurposed it. as a programmable molecular scalpel.
By guiding it with a custom strand of RNA, we can tell the CRISPR system to find a specific genetic sequence inside a living cell and edit it.
Which means you aren't just relying on killing a cell to solve a problem.
No, you are executing programmable genetic operations.
You can use CRISPR to disable a specific metabolic pathway that is producing a toxin, for example.
Or you can introduce a functional change that makes a cell produce a valuable enzyme.
And that level of intervention requires an equally precise mechanism for control. Which brings us to layer 3.
Optogenetics.
Optogenetics. This is the ability to use light-sensitive proteins to turn biological processes on and off.
Instead of relying on slow chemical reactions to trigger a change in a cell, you can introduce proteins that physically change their shape when exposed to a specific wavelength of light.
That is the part that feels like absolute magic.
It really does.
You can literally flash a specific color of light at a culture of cells to activate a specific gene, and then flash a different wavelength of light a millisecond later to turn it off.
It gives you real-time digital control over living biology.
But the text pushes this concept even further with what Enfield calls the prion revelation.
The prion revelation. Now, when most people hear the word prion, they immediately think of terrifying, incurable neurological diseases.
Like mad cow disease or chronic wasting disease.
Right. We think of them as rogue, misfolded proteins that act like non-programmable, destructive zombies in the brain.
But the sources shatter that myth completely.
Enfield details how researchers are now utilizing 3 programmable modes for prions, proving that protein folding states are dynamic physical conditions that can be selected and directed by electromagnetic signals.
Let's walk through those 3 modes for you, because the implications are wild.
The first mode is destruction.
Destruction. Researchers have figured out how to use near-infrared light combined with carbon nanosheets to safely target and dissolve toxic prion aggregates.
They can break these terrifying clumps back down into non-toxic fragments.
The near-infrared light isn't just burning them. It acts as a physical instruction that forces the protein to change its structural state.
And if you can instruct a protein to disassemble, you can also instruct it to assemble, which is the second mode, construction.
Construction. The text details how scientists are using UVB light to trigger the folding of specific protein oligomers at precise moments.
This gives the researchers perfect temporal control. They don't have to mix chemicals in a vat and wait for a reaction.
They can shine a UVB light and instantly trigger the construction of a specific protein architecture.
And then there's the third mode, engineering.
Engineering, which honestly sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but the sources cite it as a reality.
Researchers are using targeted visible light to guide prion scaffolds into assembling microscopic gold and silver nanowires.
Let's just pause and consider the mechanics of that for a moment. They are taking a biological protein, using light as the programming code to direct its behavior.
And using it to manufacture an inorganic metallic structure.
The biological protein is the factory machinery. The visible light is the software program executing the command. And the silver nanowire is the final manufactured product.
It fundamentally blurs the line between biology and manufacturing.
And the underlying philosophy here, which we touched on earlier, is that biology is fundamentally an information processing system.
We have spent centuries putting biology, physics, computer science, and energy into completely different academic silos.
But Enfield argues that something as ancient as photosynthesis isn't just a biological quirk of plants.
No, it is a highly advanced light capture, data processing, and energy conversion technology.
When a photon hits a leaf, it triggers an electron transport chain that is processing environmental data and converting it into chemical bonds.
When we finally recognize that biology operates on code and data just as much as a silicon computer does, we realize that programmable biology isn't just a neat trick for pharmaceutical labs.
It is an architectural platform capable of rebuilding the infrastructure of the planet.
And Enfield provides a brilliant, real-world example of how this stack could be deployed to solve an ecological crisis today.
Cyanobacterial blooms.
Yes, these are those toxic blue-green algae blooms that plague freshwater lakes. They kill wildlife, they threaten drinking water supplies.
Right now, our standard industrial solution is to dump tons of copper sulfate into the water.
It is the ultimate sledgehammer approach.
Yes, it kills the toxic algae, but it also kills the beneficial aquatic plants. It disrupts the entire food web and leaves heavy metals to settle into the sediment.
But if we apply the programmable biology stack to that same lake, the approach is entirely different.
We introduce a specific bacteriophage that targets only the toxic strain of cyanobacteria.
It acts as the delivery vehicle, but instead of delivering a payload that explodes the cell, it delivers an optogenetic CRISPR sequence.
And because cyanobacteria float on the surface and are naturally exposed to sunlight, we can use light signals to literally turn off their toxin-producing genes.
You don't even have to kill the algae.
You just rewrite its behavior in real time.
You turn off the toxin production, but leave its beneficial nitrogen-fixing abilities completely intact.
You have used a microscopic scalpel to cure the ecosystem without spilling a single drop of toxic chemical.
It is an elegant solution. But of course, any architecture this radical faces practical limitations, and Enfield doesn't shy away from them.
The most glaring challenge to relying on algae and duckweed to run our infrastructure is geography.
Right. How do we deploy highly sensitive, light and temperature-dependent biological systems in a place like Nebraska or Iowa?
Places where winter temperatures routinely plunge to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
A duckweed channel or an open-air algae pond will simply freeze solid from November to March.
You can't run a national jet fuel supply chain on an algae pond that turns into an ice skating rink for half the year.
Enfield addresses this head-on with what he calls the biosphere imperative.
His answer to the seasonality objection is massive controlled environment agriculture.
Biosphere greenhouses.
And he points out that we already have the proof of concept sitting right there in the freezing Great Plains.
The Henry Doorly Zoo's Lied Jungle in Omaha, Nebraska.
It is a perfect example. The Lied Jungle is a 1.5-acre, fully enclosed tropical rainforest. It has been maintained in the middle of the Midwest for over 30 years.
It houses tropical plants, massive trees, diverse wildlife,
Yeah.
completely insulated from the blizzards outside.
It definitively proves that the biological systems and the structural engineering required to maintain a tropical environment in a freezing climate already exist and work perfectly.
The structural engineering works, yes. But the obvious catch is the cost.
Right.
The zoo pays an absolute fortune in natural gas and electricity just to heat that building and keep those tropical plants alive through a Nebraska winter. You couldn't possibly scale that up to thousands of acres of agricultural biomes without bankrupting the system, right?
That is where Enfield introduces the critical concept of industrial symbiosis.
Industrial symbiosis.
He looks at our current energy grid and points out its thermodynamic absurdity. Take a standard 500-megawatt coal or natural gas power plant.
Fundamentally, it is just a giant heat engine.
It burns fuel to boil water to spin a turbine, but it only converts about a third of its thermal energy into electricity.
The rest of that energy, somewhere between 400 to 600 megawatts of continuous, intense thermal energy, is considered waste heat.
The plant literally spends millions of dollars building and operating massive cooling towers just to throw that heat away into the atmosphere.
And at the exact same time, you have massive ethanol refineries in the Midwest that are fermenting corn and venting thousands of tons of 99% pure CO2 directly into the sky.
Exactly. So on one side of the ledger, you have power plants paying money to throw away heat. On the other side, you have refineries venting pure carbon dioxide.
And meanwhile, commercial greenhouses burn massive amounts of expensive natural gas just to generate the heat and CO2 that their plants desperately need to grow.
The current system is fragmented and thermodynamically blind.
So Enfield's blueprint is almost aggressively logical here. Instead of venting that waste heat and CO2, you physically pipe it directly into giant, completely enclosed greenhouses built adjacent to these industrial facilities.
And this isn't just theory. The sources point to real-world examples operating right now.
Look at the Howling Nurseries in Utah.
They have 30 acres of commercial greenhouses that are heated entirely by capturing the exhaust from the Current Creek natural gas power plant right next door.
And the ADM Decatur ethanol project in Illinois already captures its pure fermentation CO2. They currently pump it underground, but it's captured and ready.
We just need to connect the pipes.
And if anyone doubts that we can move CO2 safely at scale, Enfield points to the OCFP pipeline in the Netherlands.
They took an old, inactive oil pipeline and repurposed it.
Today, it carries 500,000 tons of industrial CO2 per year from the massive petrochemical plants at the Port of Rotterdam directly to over 600 separate greenhouse horticulture businesses.
The thermodynamic and financial accounting of this model is beautiful.
By physically connecting the power plant to the biosphere greenhouse, you eliminate two massive cost centers simultaneously.
The power plant doesn't have to run expensive cooling towers, and the greenhouse doesn't have to buy natural gas.
The industrial exhaust suddenly transforms from a toxic liability into the exact vital feedstock the biological system requires.
You create a year-round, weatherproof biological production engine.
I want you to imagine the visual of the Nebraska landscape transformed by this model.
You still have a massive industrial power plant, but instead of being surrounded by barren, frozen brown fields in the dead of winter, it is surrounded by glowing 50-acre tropical glass biomes.
And inside those massive biomes, utilizing the free heat and the free CO2, they are churning out continuous, high-yield harvests of algae for jet fuel.
Duckweed for livestock, tilapia from aquaculture tanks, structural bamboo for construction.
All while a blizzard is raging outside.
It completely redefines what a farm looks like.
And this brings us back to the geopolitical reality check from the very beginning of the source text.
When the Strait of Hormuz closes on February 28, 2026.
Right. When 20% of the world's traded oil is suddenly blocked, causing gas prices to spike 17%, a glowing 50-acre algae biome in Nebraska is no longer just an environmental luxury.
Or a neat science experiment. It becomes a matter of urgent national security.
Absolutely. The U.S. military alone consumes roughly 100 million gallons of jet fuel every single day.
100 million gallons a day. The logistics of moving that fuel around the world are incredibly vulnerable to blockades and conflict.
But the biological solution is already proven. The sources highlight that DARPA, along with the U.S. Navy's Great Green Fleet Initiative, have already successfully demonstrated that algae-derived biofuel is a perfect drop-in replacement for conventional aviation and rocket fuel.
The term drop-in replacement is key here.
It means you don't have to redesign the jet engines. You don't have to build new airplanes.
The algae oil perfectly mimics the chemical properties of fossil fuel, so you just put it directly into the existing fuel tanks.
We have the biological technology, we have the waste heat from the power plants, and we have the CO2. The only thing missing is the infrastructure to tie it all together.
And that leads to the inevitable question. If the science works and the economics make sense, why haven't we done this yet?
The sources address the dissenting arguments, acknowledging that any infrastructural shift of this magnitude will face intense resistance.
One of the primary objections Enfield addresses is the property rights, or what some critics call the socialism objection.
Right. When Enfield proposes mandating ecological buffer zones, like requiring farmers to install duckweed ditches to capture runoff, critics immediately argue that this is a form of regulatory taking.
They argue that the government is dictating how private property must be used, which sounds like top-down socialist planning.
It's a valid concern to raise in a free market system, but Enfield's rebuttal is fascinating.
He frames his concept of planetary citizenship not as socialism, but as strict, mathematically accurate free market capitalism.
And we should be clear, as we unpack this, we are simply reporting how the source material frames this debate. We aren't taking a political stance on environmental regulations here.
Of course. But Enfield's argument is that in our current system, polluters are heavily subsidized because they are allowed to externalize their costs.
Right. If a factory dumps chemicals into a river, they are saving money on waste disposal. But the town downstream has to build a multi-million-dollar water filtration plant.
The town is subsidizing the factory's profits.
Exactly. The downstream farmer whose well goes dry, the coastal fisherman whose livelihood is destroyed by the dead zone, the future generations who have to deal with atmospheric carbon.
They're all forcibly paying the hidden bill for the polluter's cheap production.
Enfield argues that mandating a duckweed ditch or an ecological buffer zone is simply forcing a company to internalize its actual production costs.
It closes the ledger. It ensures that the price of a product reflects the true cost of making it, including the cost of cleaning up the waste.
That isn't socialism. That is ending a hidden subsidy.
And then there's the other major objection, which is more philosophical, the playing God or Genesis objection.
People are naturally uncomfortable with the idea of programmable biology.
The idea of using light to rewrite the genes of a living cell feels to some like a dangerous overreach of human power.
Enfield clarifies that this objection often relies on a romanticized, inaccurate view of nature.
Humans have been aggressively modifying the natural world for 10,000 years.
The corn growing in a modern field and the cattle standing in a feedlot are highly engineered, highly modified organisms created through centuries of selective breeding.
They do not exist in the wild.
Right. A modern ear of corn is a technological artifact as much as a smartphone is.
Enfield argues that using precise, programmable biology like bacteriophages and optogenetics is actually an act of highly responsible stewardship.
If you have a toxic algae bloom, it is far more ethical and far safer to use a targeted light signal to turn off the toxin gene than it is to blindly dump hundreds of pounds of toxic copper sulfate into a lake and kill everything in it.
We are already playing God with the ecosystem. Programmable biology just gives us a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
What becomes clear as you read through these essays is that the true barrier to this architecture isn't the lack of scientific knowledge.
And it isn't even a lack of economic viability.
The true barrier is institutional inertia. We have built our entire modern society in rigid administrative silos.
The sanitation department manages the sewage, the agricultural extension service manages the fertilizer, and the utility commission manages the power plant.
And none of them talk to each other.
Exactly. They exist in completely separate regulatory and financial worlds.
The sanitation engineer's only job is to get rid of the sewage as cheaply as possible. They aren't incentivized to think about how that sewage could become valuable fertilizer for the agriculture department.
The challenge is spanning those bureaucratic boundaries to create a circular system.
Which is why Enfield makes a really sharp observation about the environmental movement itself.
He points out that environmentalism has historically suffered from terrible branding.
For decades, the message has been about reduction and sacrifice. Drive less, consume less, accept a lower standard of living to save the planet.
But building a duckweed channel or piping CO2 into a massive greenhouse isn't a sacrifice.
It is a massive, direct business upgrade. A farmer who installs a duckweed loop saves thousands of dollars a year in synthetic fertilizer costs.
Protects their own downstream well water.
And can generate and sell biogas. The financial return is the driver here, not just altruism.
This brings us to the final, sweeping expansion of Enfield's architecture, taking these closed biological loops and operating them on a planetary scale.
The sources introduce what he calls the state park node model.
Think about the public lands we already have. State and national parks already possess the land management mandate.
They have the ecological focus and the educational infrastructure to interface with the public.
Enfield proposes positioning 10 to 50-acre biosphere greenhouses directly on these public lands, ideally situated next to existing industrial facilities to capture that waste heat and CO2.
And the purpose of these nodes isn't just to grow tomatoes. It is to mass-produce the biological tools needed for ecological repair.
These nodes would act as regional engines, mass-producing native seeds, aquatic macrophytes, and wetland plant stocks year-round, regardless of the local winter.
And then the architecture scales globally. You connect those regional nodes to massive international institutions.
Like Kew's Millennium Seed Bank in England. The sources mention Kew's unlocked phase, which represents a crucial paradigm shift.
For years, seed banks have acted like doomsday vaults, just storing genetic material away in case of an apocalypse.
The unlocked phase shifts them from passive storage vaults to active distribution hubs,
sending out biological material to these regional biosphere greenhouses to be mass-propagated and deployed into the wild.
And deploying that material is vital when we look at the concept of blue carbon, which the sources highlight as one of the most powerful biological tools on Earth.
We talked about how terrestrial forests are slow at capturing carbon, but marine ecosystems operate on an entirely different level.
Seaglass meadows, for example, can capture and store carbon more than 3 times faster than a mature tropical rainforest.
And the storage mechanism is far more secure.
Mangroves and salt marshes drop their biological material into anaerobic, waterlogged soils.
Because there is no oxygen in the soil, the material doesn't decompose. It just builds up layer after layer, creating ancient, deep vaults of trapped carbon that have been sequestered for thousands of years.
The statistics on blue carbon in the sources are genuinely mind-blowing.
The total combined global area of mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrass meadows is tiny. They cover only about 2 to 6% of the total area of tropical forests.
Yet, when we dredge or degrade them, the release of that ancient carbon is so massive that it accounts for up to 19% of all global deforestation emissions.
19%, which is why the biosphere greenhouses are so critical.
We can use those controlled environments to mass propagate mangrove seedlings, salt marsh grasses, and even climate-resilient coral fragments.
We can literally manufacture the living ecosystem repair kits required to rebuild those coastal defenses and lock that carbon back away.
This raises a fascinating question, and the sources take it to the absolute ultimate frontier.
If we can master this architecture on Earth, Where does it take us next?
If you look at aerospace applications, the exact same closed-loop biological architecture we've been discussing for the Midwest is the absolute prerequisite for human survival in space.
It is the ultimate test of the system.
If you are building a space station or trying to establish a permanent human colony on Mars, you are dealing with the most extreme resource constraints imaginable.
You cannot afford a linear fallacy on Mars.
You cannot burn a resource and throw the waste away because there is no way.
You can't open a window to vent CO2, and you can't flush a toilet into a river.
Every single atom has to be accounted for and reused.
And the only system capable of doing that efficiently is biology. Mechanical scrubbers break down. Chemical filters get saturated.
But a biological system repairs and replicates itself. You use a bioreactor full of algae to eat the carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew, and in return, it produces fresh oxygen and nutrient-dense lipids for food.
You use a closed-loop duckweed system to aggressively clean and recycle the crew's wastewater, turning the human waste back into clean water and plant biomass.
Connects the local directly to the cosmic here. The biological tools and the complex circular pathways required to keep a human being alive in the freezing, dead vacuum of space are the exact same tools required to save a depleted, over-fertilized cornfield in Nebraska.
It's the exact same plumbing.
It is. It proves that this isn't just a niche regional agricultural fix. Enfield is outlining a general operating architecture for advanced civilization.
It's the roadmap for how we finally transition from a primitive species that endlessly mines its environment to an advanced species that programs and cultivates its environment, perfectly closing the loop on matter and energy.
So true.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? The systems that power the device you are listening to this on, the fuel sitting in your car's gas tank, the food in your refrigerator, they're all currently running on a linear system that is rapidly running out of runway.
The aquifers are dropping beneath our feet. The dead zones are expanding in our oceans. And global supply chains are choking at bottlenecks like the Strait of Hormuz.
But the profound takeaway from Enfield's essays is that the tools to reprogram that failing system from the ground up are already here.
The bacteriophages, the duckweed, the high-yield algae, the CRISPR scalpels, the waste heat pipelines, they aren't science fiction. They exist today.
They are patient, they are infinitely efficient, and they are just waiting for us to stop treating them as separate academic disciplines and start connecting the pipes.
The science is settled. The thermodynamics and the economics are favorable.
The only thing standing in the way is our stubborn willingness to look at waste as a liability, rather than recognizing it as a valuable resource, desperately searching for its biological partner.
Well said.
I want to leave you with a specific lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. What if the first thriving, truly sustainable human settlement on Mars doesn't owe its success to a massive breakthrough in cold, heavy mechanical engineering? What if, instead, our survival out there among the stars is entirely dependent on the humble lessons we finally learned from a duckweed ditch and a repurposed coal plant back in Nebraska? Keep questioning the infrastructure around you, because the solutions might just be floating on the surface of the water, waiting to be put to work. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
You know, what if our biggest environmental crises all come down to just one single fundamental mistake in how we think? Today, we're going to dive into the work of Zachary Enfield and explore a pretty radical idea that the solution isn't some brand new futuristic technology, but a complete reimagining of the systems we already have. And this is the question that changes everything. Seriously, what if the CO2 pouring out of a smokestack or the fertilizer washing off a farm, what if that isn't waste at all? What if it's actually a valuable resource that's just in the wrong place? So to really understand the solution, we first have to get a handle on the core problem. And Enfield has a great name for it. He calls it our system's one-way street. This is what he calls the linear fallacy, this idea that we've built our entire modern world on a huge mistake. We take something, we use it, and then we throw it away. But here's the thing. There is no away. That broken one-way system is the real source of so many of our biggest environmental headaches. A perfect and, frankly, terrifying example of this fallacy lies deep beneath the American Great Plains. It's a vast, ancient body of water called the Ogallala Aquifer. The scale of our linear thinking here is it's staggering. It took nature up to 12 million years to fill this thing up. It's taken us less than a century to nearly drain it dry. We're treating a geological savings account like it's petty cash. And the results are pretty scary. In some places, the water level has dropped by over 150 feet. That's not a leak, that's a hemorrhage. It's a non-renewable resource, mined and then basically just lost to the atmosphere through evaporation. It's a one-way trip to empty. And you know, this same one-way logic is playing out on our farms. We pour millions of tons of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer onto our fields, but a huge chunk of it never even gets to the crops. It just washes away, flows all the way down the Mississippi River, and creates this massive 6,000 square mile dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, it's not waste, it's just misplaced fertility, creating a catastrophe where it doesn't belong. So that's the problem, and yeah, it's big, it's systemic, but what if the solution is incredibly small? As we're about to see, nature has already given us the tiny engines we need to fix our broken systems. Just think about our current approach to biofuels. Soybeans give you about 48 gallons per acre. Not bad. But now look at microalgae. They can produce up to 10,000 gallons in the same amount of space. This isn't just a little bit better, it's a revolutionary leap. But wait, it gets even better. Algae aren't just fuel factories, they're also these incredible carbon-sucking machines. For every kilogram of algae you grow, it pulls nearly 2 kilograms of CO2 right out of the air. So it's doing two incredible things at once, producing fuel while cleaning the atmosphere. And let's meet our second tiny engine, duckweed. This stuff is, well, it's incredible. It's one of the fastest growing plants on the entire planet, and it just so happens to love eating the exact misplaced fertility, that nitrogen and phosphorus, that's causing the dead zone in the Gulf. It literally eats pollution for breakfast. Okay, so we've got the problems, our one-way streets, and we've got the solutions, these tiny biological engines. So now let's look at how we actually connect them to finally close the loop on these broken systems. This quote from Enfield, it gets right to the heart of the whole mind shift we need. Waste isn't an endpoint. It's just matter in motion, waiting for us to plug it back into a cycle. So how does this actually work in the real world? Well, take an industrial plant. Instead of venting all its CO2 into the atmosphere, we pipe it directly into a pond full of algae. The algae absolutely feasts on that concentrated CO2, growing unbelievably fast. Then we harvest it, press it for oil, and turn that oil into fuel. And just like that, the plant's pollution has become a revenue stream. The loop is officially closed. And you can apply the exact same logic on the farm. Instead of letting fertilizer runoff poison our rivers, we channel it into a duckweed pond. The duckweed scrubs the water clean by gobbling up all those nutrients. We can then harvest that duckweed and put it right back on the fields as a super potent, slow-release biofertilizer. The problem has now become its own solution. So these solutions are practical, they're elegant, for sure. But Enfield argues they require more than just clever engineering. They require a totally new ethical framework, a different way of seeing our place on this planet. He calls it planetary citizenship, and it's a really simple but incredibly powerful idea. If we want to enjoy all the benefits of a living planet, clean air, fresh water, a stable climate, then we have a responsibility to help maintain the systems that provide them. It's not a free ride. And this breaks down into some pretty common sense principles. It means if you pollute, you have to restore what you damage. It means owning land isn't just a right to extract, it's an obligation to be a good steward. And this one's huge. It means we have to redefine productivity. Pumping an ancient aquifer dry isn't being productive. It's just cashing out a million-year-old savings account and calling it income. Ultimately, this all brings us to a really fundamental choice. And it's not just about our technology, but about the kind of world we actually want to build and live in. And here is that choice, side by side. On the left, you've got the linear system we have now. It extracts, it depletes, and it turns our natural capital into trash for short-term profit. But on the right, you have this circular system we could build, one that recycles and regenerates, converts waste into value, and builds natural capital that can be productive pretty much forever. And as Enfield puts it, the science here is pretty much settled. Using algae to capture carbon, using duckweed to cycle nutrients, these aren't just wild theories. They are documented, tested, proven processes. The real question is no longer can we do this, it's will we? Which leaves us all with this final thought. For so long, we've been looking for these complex, high-tech, mechanical fixes to our biggest environmental problems. But what if the answer has been here all along? Simple, biological, and quietly floating on the surface, just waiting for us to finally notice.